we have covered 3 of Earth's 4 spheres, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. So now we're moving into the 4th sphere, which is the biosphere. Now, we're not going to go way in depth with this because really that's what biology class covers, but we do want to kind of focus on a couple of different topics. So first of all, we are going to be dividing the biosphere into smaller and smaller divisions. So from biggest to smallest, it goes biosphere, biome, ecosystem, community, population, individual. Let's define those. So a biome is really similar to a climate. Climate just focuses on the actual weather in that location. Biome comes in and adds things like vegetation and the organisms that live there. So we're not really going to talk about biomes since we did just finish climate. Ecosystems where we're going to focus today. So those are areas within a biome where you've got an interaction of living biotic factors and non-living abiotic factors. Community gets a little more specific. These are the organisms that directly depend on each other. So things like members of a food web would be an example of that. And then population is looking at one particular species in a community, and then down to one individual organism. So when we're talking about population, a couple of things, just making sure that we understand what could change a population. So obviously births, immigration, organisms moving into a population would increase the population. Decreasing the population would be things like deaths and emigration. So notice the different spellings there, where individuals leave a population maybe due to lack of resources. So they would go somewhere else. And then these things called limiting factors. So limiting factors are just resources needed for life, and if they're in small supply, it's going to limit the size of your population. So there's 2 major categories of that. Density dependent factors, so they depend on how big the population is. So the bigger your population, the more you're going to find these things. Excuse me. So disease, we've seen that with the coronavirus, that more heavily populated places are the places that are getting hit the hardest with this. Things like parasites, where it can spread from organism to organism, and then lack of food, because if you've got a really big population, your food supply is going to be in danger. Density independent factors, independent of any kind of population. So they're going to affect populations really without worrying about how big or small they are. And a really good example of this are natural disasters. Like a tornado doesn't care if it hits a big place or a small place. It's just a natural disaster. So those are things that affect a population really regardless of its size. Things that affect a population would, the limiting factors lead up to that maximum population that you can have in a particular environment, and that's called your carrying capacity. So if you're below that, the population has the ability to grow. If it gets above the carrying capacity, that's where you start to have those natural progressions of the population dropping. So more organisms get sick, and so the population dies off that way. There's food shortages, so the population dies off that way. But nature finds a way to get it to drop back below that carrying capacity. So if resources were unlimited, if there were no limiting factors, then we would see an exponential growth of the population. The population would just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there'd be resources to support that. So with an exponential curve, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with these, especially in our current times, but it's that J-shaped curve where it gets higher and higher a little bit at a time, and then really just skyrockets up. That's not really realistic for long-term population though, because resources are limited. So eventually there ends up being this leveling off, this S shape to your curve. So it still starts as the J, you can kind of see it there at the beginning of the curve, but it starts to level off as your carrying capacity. This is called logistic growth. This is where the population will grow as long as there's resources, But when the resources start being in limited supply, that population will kind of level off. Now, why do we care about this stuff? We want to talk about how population changes within an ecosystem. And the first way we're going to talk about it is with predation. So one organism eating another organism. So just kind of looking here, reminding ourselves about how to read a food chain. So what does the frog eat? That's right, it eats the caterpillar. And what's eating the frog? The snake. So what we care about is more how the population would change. So if we had a boom in the frog population, what would happen to our caterpillar population? Well, it would decrease, right? Because we'd have way more predators eating those caterpillars. Now, if the frog population increases, what's going to happen to our flower population? Well, if the caterpillar is the thing eating the flower and the caterpillar population goes down, then our flower is going to have a boom in its population. So just kind of looking at the dynamics of how does one organism's population affect really everybody else's. Because you've got to have predator and prey populations in balance with each other. If we have way more predators than prey, then there's going to be a ton of competition, and predators are either going to kill each other or they're going to die from lack of food. If we have a boom in the prey population, then we have that exponential growth of prey where they don't have enough predators to keep them in check. So they're going to start to experience things like food shortages, and that's what's going to cause their population to drop. So you want those things in balance with each other, not one much greater than the other. Now, when we're talking about relationships in ecosystems, it's way more complicated than that food chain that I showed you there. So when you talk about, hey, if this population changed, what would happen to everybody else's? It's a little more complicated. It's not as black and white as it would be with a food chain. That's because ecosystems are carefully balanced. It's like a game of Jenga. So if you take one Jenga piece out, it may not make a difference to the tower, or it may be the Jenga piece that makes the whole tower fall down, and you never really know until you actually pull it out. So as we're talking about this, thinking about the importance of every single organism in that ecosystem. So if a species dies in an ecosystem, every other organism is affected. Now, some of them are going to go up, some of them are going to go down, but all of them are affected. So if we lose, say, the caterpillar in that food web there, all the predator populations are going to have to change because now they've lost one of their food sources. The prey population is going to change. So how are those flowers going to be affected? And then the fellow competitors. Who else is eating those flowers, and how are their populations going to change? And then there's a trickle effect to those competitors' predators. And it just goes on and on and on. But every single organism in that ecosystem is going to change because of one organism's population change. Not only are all the biotic factors going to change, we're actually going to see abiotic factors changing as well. You know, if I've got a bacteria species that dies off, the soil is going to change, because remember, that's how we get soil formation in the first place. Or if we have a fish kill in a river, the water itself, the water quality, the oxygen levels in the water, all of those things are going to change. Or if we have a tree species that dies off, how is that going to affect things like the carbon dioxide levels in the air? Those are all non-living things, but they're affected by these changes in the ecosystem. It is possible that the Jenga tower can stand. It's possible that the caterpillars could completely go extinct and everything in that ecosystem would kind of readjust and make do. it's also possible that that one change, the caterpillars changing, could affect that ecosystem so much that species by species by species die off and that entire ecosystem changes. So we don't really ever know until those things happen, which is why we need to be careful and care about every organism that's being affected, because we don't know which thing is going to drop that tower.